Good morning, viewers. Today, we'll see some details regarding metaphysical poetry. As you know, the previous age, that is, the age of Shakespeare, was the golden age of songs and lyrics. Various factors contributed to the development of lyric poetry during this period. The feeling of stability, peace, and contentment enabled poets to compose songs and lyrics full of zest for life and on a variety of themes such as love, religion, patriotism, and philosophy. Even plays and prose romances were so full of songs and lyrics that it could be rightly said that merry England was a nest of singing birds. This was the age of such geniuses as William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, Edmund Spenser, and Sir Philip Sidney. The coming century, that is, the 17th century, poetry declined during the reign of King James I and King Charles I until his execution in 1649. But Elizabethan poets like Shakespeare, Michael Drayton, and Samuel Daniel did their finest works in the reign of King James I, that is 1603 to 1625. That was the time when King James I ruled over England. This period also saw the rise of a new kind of poetry with John Donne, which later came to be known as the metaphysical school of poetry. Now let's see what is metaphysical poetry. The word metaphysical is made up of two parts: meta, which means beyond, and physics refers to our physical world. So, metaphysics means beyond our world or outside of the ordinary. In simple terms, metaphysics refers to ideas or concepts that exist outside of our senses. These are abstract concepts. For example, when we ask questions like what is love, or what is death, or what is life, these questions can be called as metaphysical questions. In poetry, the metaphysical centers on the exploration of abstract ideas and philosophical concepts. So, the metaphysical poetry, it tends to understand concepts like life or love or death or again religion. So, these are abstract ideas or philosophical concepts. The term metaphysical poets was coined by Samuel Johnson in 1779 to categorize a collection of 17th century poets who shared similar characteristics. So, thus, we understand that metaphysical poets were never an official group. So, they were not an official group. During the time when they lived, there was no such school of poetry known as the metaphysical school. It was later in the 18th or towards the end of the 18th century that Dr. Samuel Johnson referred to a group of poets of the 17th century as metaphysical poets. Metaphysical poetry is a group of poems that share common characteristics. They are all highly intellectualized, using rather strange imagery, contain extremely complicated thought, using frequent paradox and complex metaphors to explore the human experience. The style of these poets was characterized by wit and metaphysical conceits, that is, far-fetched or unusual similes or metaphors. Use of metaphysical conceit, which employs elaborate extended metaphors to connect seemingly unrelated things or ideas. Okay, the defining features of this group include wit and wordplay, use of complex metaphors, intellectual or philosophical concepts, playful or paradoxical language to explore human experience, and the exploration of the relationship between physical forms and abstract concepts. Thus, metaphysical poetry is a style of poetry that flourished in the 17th century England, characterized by its use of these defining features. It often explores themes related to religion, morality, and love. Now, as I said earlier, metaphysical poetry is known for its use of metaphysical conceit. Now, what is a metaphysical conceit? A metaphysical conceit is an extended metaphor. See, when we say metaphor, it means that it is a comparison. Now, what kind of a comparison is a conceit? A metaphysical conceit is an extended metaphor that makes an outstretched comparison between a person's spiritual faculties and a physical object in the world. See, in the earlier slide, I told you a metaphysical means beyond the physical world. And again, it is the abstract concepts that we are dealing. So, when we talk about a metaphysical conceit in that sense, there will be a comparison between these abstract ideas and something from the physical world. For example, in the poem A Valediction Forbidding Mourning by John Donne, the poet argues for the lovers' closeness by comparing their souls to the feet of a drawing compass. In that particular poem, the poet John Donne is making a comparison, and the things compared are the two souls of the lovers and the 2 feet of a compass. So the comparison is made between the soul and the feet of a compass. Between the soles and the feet of a compass. So how can there be a comparison between these two things? The poet says that just like how the 2 feet of a compass is joined or is combined at the top, similarly, no matter how far the lovers may be from each other, their souls are united. That is the comparison made by John Donne in that poem. So the concept of souls, something which is an abstract idea, and that concept or that abstract idea is compared to an object from the physical world. So this type of comparison is known as a metaphysical conceit. Metaphysical poets such as John Donne and Andrew Marvell, among others, made use of metaphysical conceits to explore the relationships between lovers. It is the unusual nature of the comparison that makes these a conceit. The metaphysical poets desired to say what they hoped and had never been said before. They cared to be unique in their thoughts and worked out their own manner of expressing them. In this regard, Sir Walter Scott remarks, they played with thoughts as the Elizabethans had played with emotions, while H.J.C. Grierson observes, the metaphysicals of the 17th century combined two things, the fantastic dialectics of medieval love poetry and the simple sensuous strain caught from the classics. The first chapter on Abraham Cowley of Dr. Johnson's book Lives of the Most Eminent English Poets refers to the metaphysical poets as there appeared a race of writers that may be termed the metaphysical poets. This does not necessarily imply that Dr. Johnson intended metaphysical to be used in its true sense. He was probably referring to a witty comment of John Dryden, who said of John Donne, he affects the metaphysics not only in his satires but in his amorous verses, where nature only should reign, and perplexes the minds of the fair sex with nice speculations of philosophy, when he should engage their hearts and entertain them with the softnesses of love. So that was a censure by John Dryden about John Donne. You can see the beginning of the quote. He affects the metaphysics. So this was the term that Dr. Samuel Johnson later uses in his book Lives of the Most Eminent English Poets to refer to this particular class of poets of the 17th century. The only writer before Dryden to speak of the new style of poetry was Drummond of Hawthornden, who, in an undated letter from the 1630s, made the charge that some men of late, transformers of everything, consulted upon her reformation and endeavoured to abstract her to metaphysical ideas and scholastical quiddities, denuding her of her own habits and those ornaments with which she hath amused the world some 1,000 years. So here, Drummond might be referring to poetry, which has amused the world from some 1,000 years. But at present, the metaphysical poets, they are trying to change the ultimate aim of poetry itself. That is, they thought poetry as shouldn't amuse, but it should be highly intellectual. Dr. Johnson thus comments about metaphysical poetry as the metaphysical poets were men of learning, and to show their learning was their whole endeavor. The most heterogeneous ideas are yoked by violence together. Nature and art are ransacked for illustrations, comparisons, and allusions. Their learning instructs, and their subtlety surprises. But the reader commonly thinks his improvement dearly bought, and though he sometimes admires, is seldom pleased. So this was a comment made by Dr. Johnson. This comment clearly sums up the characteristics of metaphysical poets. The metaphysical poets, they were highly intellectual men of learning. Use of dissimilar and far-fetched images, strange and uncanny ideas, hyperbolic expressions, or elliptical language. The readers admire them for their learning, but we are never amused as we are by the Elizabethan or Romantic poets. So that is the defining features of almost all the metaphysical poets. They are highly intellectual men of learning, and whatever they tried to convey, it was very strange. It were very strange and uncanny ideas, and all their comparisons, they were very far-fetched ideas or images. Something at the first place, they will we readers, we will admire them for their comparisons, for their learning, but we are seldom amused. We will be amused by the poets of the Elizabethan age. We will be amused by the poets of the Romantic era, but we'll never be amused by the metaphysical poets. In his initial use of the term, Dr. Johnson quoted just three poets as metaphysical. They were Abraham Cowley, John Donne, and Abraham Cleveland. It was Colin Burrow who later singled out John Donne, George Herbert, Henry Vaughan, Andrew Marvell, and Richard Crashaw as central figures of the metaphysical school. The most important metaphysical poet was John Donne, who is also recognized as the father of metaphysical poetry. His poems like The Flea, A Valediction Forbidden, Morning, The Good Morrow, and The Sun Rising are defining of the metaphysical genre. The other significant metaphysical poets who share similar characteristics were Henry Vaughan, Andrew Marvell, and George Herbert. Similar to the Romantic poets, the metaphysical poets too can be classified as first generation metaphysical poets. As you can see, it was John Donne and George Herbert who were born in the 16th century, and John Donne served as the leading figure for the second generation of metaphysical poets, most of whom were born in the 17th century. The metaphysical poets are also known as the Baroque poets. The term Baroque is a French word which means irregular shape. It is a style of artistic expression that gained popularity in the 17th century. In art criticism, the word Baroque has come to describe anything irregular, bizarre, or otherwise departing from rules and proportions established during the Renaissance. This itself tells us why the metaphysical poets have been described as Baroque poets. The metaphysical poets, they departed from the common rules and proportions of writing poetry, which was established during the Renaissance or during the Elizabethan age. We know that the Elizabethan age flourished in lyric poetry, especially the sonnets. But here, among the metaphysical poets, they cannot be called as lyrical poets. Whatever they wrote as poetry, it departed from the normal rules. It consisted of conceit, of wit and wonder. The key concepts of Baroque poetry was conceit, wit and wonder. The writing style is extravagant, heavily ornamented or bizarre. The term Baroque also refers to highly ornate style of prose or poetry, that is, highly elaborate use of language, use of uncanny or strange metaphors. The metaphysical poetry can be classified into two broad divisions: the amorous verses and the religious verses. The amorous verses were written largely by the courtly poets such as Andrew Marvell, Thomas Carew, Sir John Suckling, and Richard Lovelace, whereas the religious verses were written by George Herbert, Richard Crashaw, and Henry Vaughan. There were also poets who excelled in writing both religious and amorous verses like John Donne and Robert Herrick. Now let's take a look into some other points under this topic. As we have already understood, metaphysical school has given rise to much critical studies, and several points have always been important from the examination point of view. Two key anthologists were responsible for identifying the common stylistic traits among 17th century poets. They were Herbert Grierson and his book Metaphysical Lyrics and Poems of the 17th Century, published in the year 1921, and Helen Gardner's Metaphysical Poets, published in 1957. Both these books were important in defining the metaphysical canon. The famous poet and critic T.S. Eliot, in his essay The Metaphysical Poets, published in 1921 in the Times Literary Supplement, used the phrase dissociation of sensibility. The phrase dissociation of sensibility refers to the way in which intellectual thought was separated from the experience of feeling among the metaphysical poets. We can understand this in very simple terms. The metaphysical poets, they tried to make a comparison between the abstract concepts or something that we can only feel or understand. It is an abstract idea. And the comparison for this abstract idea will be taken from the physical world, something that is concrete. Okay, so the feeling is separated from the intellectual thought, from the intellectual idea. So that is known as the dissociation of sensibility. T.S. Eliot's essay, The Metaphysical Poets, is a review of Grierson's anthology, Metaphysical Lyrics and Poems of the 17th Century. Another critic, John Dryden, censured John Donne for affecting the metaphysics and for perplexing the minds of the fair sex with nice speculations of philosophy, when he should engage their hearts with the softnesses of love. Dryden actually meant that instead of engaging the fairer sex or the females, engaging their hearts with the tender feelings of love, he would perplex or confuse them with his intellectual and philosophical thoughts. So that is a kind of censure of John Donne by John Dryden. Wit which Dr. Johnson applied to the metaphysical school was a kind of discordia concurs, a combination of dissimilar images or discovery of occult resemblances in things apparently unlike. Here, discordia concurs means harmony or unity gained by combining disparate or conflicting elements. See, when we consider a metaphysical conceit, the comparison is between an abstract idea and a concrete image. So, in normal situation, we can never combine an abstract and a concrete idea. But here, the metaphysical poets, they try to bring about a harmony, a unity by combining such conflicting elements. So this is known as discordia concurs, according to Dr. Johnson. Johnson claimed that the metaphysical poets were not successful in representing or moving the affections. Both John Dryden and Dr. Samuel Johnson had used the term metaphysical in a negative sense. Some details regarding Dr. Samuel Johnson's book, Lives of the Most Eminent English Poets. This book is alternatively titled as Lives of the Poets, and it gives the details of a total of 52 poets. It was in this book that Dr. Johnson coined the term metaphysical poets in the chapter on Abraham Cowley, titled Life of Cowley. Dr. Johnson condemned the metaphysical conceit as heterogeneous ideas yoked by violence together. Another critic of the 20th century, Cleanne Brooks. Her book, The Well-Wrought Urn, Studies in the Structure of Poetry, published in 1947, is a collection of essays. The title of this essay is taken from John Donne's poem, The Canonization. We'll build in sonnets pretty rooms, as well a well-wrought urn becomes, the greatest ashes as half-acre tombs. So these are the lines taken from John Donne's poem, The Canonization. The poem itself is the primary subject of the first chapter of Brooks' book, The Well-Wrought Urn. Ben Jonson remarked about Donne. For not keeping of accent, Donne deserved hanging because his rhythm resembled a casual speech. Ben Jonson tries to convey that there was no such thing as lyricism in Donne's poetry. It simply resembled the casual speech. Again, John Dryden criticizes the metaphysical poets, especially George Herbert, about their use of words and conceits in the phrase, torture one poor word 10,000 ways. The Italian poet Dante views metaphysical poetry as thoughts transmuted into the imagery of dreams. The metaphysical poets used the Carpe Diem philosophy, which derives from the classical Greco-Roman period. Regarding Andrew Marvell, the critic T.S. Eliot says that the quality of civilization is a traditional habit of life. John Donne is considered the father of the metaphysical school of poets, while George Herbert is known as the saint of the metaphysical poets. The metaphysical school of poetry was against emotional poetry. The Platonist philosopher among the metaphysical poets was John Norris, whereas the Puritan among them was Andrew Marvell. The 20th century novelist Ernest Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls takes its title from John Donne's Devotions upon Emergent Occasions, Meditation 17. The title of Dylan Thomas' Deaths and Entrances was taken from John Donne's Death's Duel. Christopher Marlowe's poem, The Passionate Shepherd to His Love, begins with the line, "Come, live with me and be my love." John Donne's poem, The Bait, begins with the same line, "Come, live with me and be my love." This is the opening line of John Donne's poem, The Bait. Now we have another poet from across the ocean, Edward Taylor, who lived during the 17th century. from 1642 to 1729. He was a colonial American poet, pastor, and physician of English origin. His poetry has been characterized as American Baroque as well as metaphysical. He was described as an American metaphysical, and his poetry typified as colonial Baroque. His poetry is included in his collections titled Meditations, which is highly spiritual and glorifying the Christian experience. Now let's have a look into some of the famous metaphysical poems. The first in the list are poems by John Donne. The Canonization, A Valediction Forbidding Mourning, The Good Morrow, The Sun Rising, The Pseudo-Martyr, Death Be Not Proud, Holy Sonnets, which includes 19 poems, and The Dream. All these are some of the very important poems written by John Donne. Next, we have some poems by Andrew Marvell. To his coy mistress, Upon Appleton House, The Garden, an Horatian ode upon Cromwell's return from Ireland, The Coronet, and The Bermudas. All these poems are written by Andrew Marvell, and probably the most famous among these is To His Coy Mistress. George Herbert, the saint among the metaphysical poets, is best known for his work, The Temple. Henry Vaughan called Herbert as a most glorious saint and seer. Steps to the Temple by Richard Crashaw shows considerable influence of George Herbert's The Temple. The World and The Retreat are the famous works by Henry Vaughan. The line, "Here lies a king that ruled as he thought fit, the universal monarch of wit," was written by Thomas Carew on the death of John Donne. It was Thomas Carew who called John Donne as the universal monarch of wit. So with this, we come to the end of today's session on the metaphysical poets. Thank you.